the midnight train. It was a chilly October night when Alan Hayes, a seasoned traveler, boarded the midnight train bound for his hometown after a long business trip. The train station was nearly deserted, with only a few scattered passengers waiting for their respective trains. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and a dense fog had begun to creep across the platform, enveloping everything in an eerie, almost supernatural shroud. Alan was not a superstitious man. He prided himself on his rationality and often scoffed at tales of ghosts and the paranormal. However, something about that night felt different off. The usual hum of activity at the station was strangely muted, as if the fog had swallowed up all the sound. Even the familiar clatter of the train's arrival seemed distant and hollow, echoing through the empty space like the final toll of a bell. As Alan stepped onto the train, he felt a strange sense of unease. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few solitary passengers seated far apart from each other. He found a seat by the window and settled in, hoping to catch some sleep during the long ride. The train began to move slowly at first, then picking up speed as it left the station and plunged into the darkness of the countryside. Little did Alan know, this train ride would be unlike any he had ever experienced. As the night wore on, the train would take him on a journey not just through the physical landscape, but through the twisted, terrifying corridors of the unknown. Chapter 1: The Phantom Passenger. The train glided smoothly along the tracks, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels against the rails providing a comforting, hypnotic background noise. Alan closed his eyes, allowing the motion of the train to lull him into a light doze. The gentle sway of the carriage and the warmth of the seat soon had him drifting off, his thoughts blurring into the shadows of sleep. But it wasn't long before he was abruptly awakened by a strange sensation of prickling at the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. Alan opened his eyes and glanced around the carriage. The passengers who had boarded with him at the station were still there, but something was different. At the far end of the carriage, a new figure had appeared, seated alone in the corner. The man was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind that hadn't been in style for decades. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He sat completely still, his hands resting on a small leather suitcase in his lap. Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this man, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As the train continued on its journey, Alan noticed that the man never moved. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't adjust his hat, didn't even seem to breathe. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if he were a statue rather than a living person. Alan tried to ignore the unsettling presence and focus on the passing scenery outside the window, but the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Alan decided to confront the man. He stood up and slowly made his way down the aisle, his footsteps echoing eerily in the otherwise silent carriage. As he approached the man, he noticed something strange. There was no reflection of the man in the windows, even though Alan could clearly see his own. "Excuse me," Alan said hesitantly, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The man didn't respond. "Excuse me, sir," Alan repeated, louder this time. Still, there was no reaction. Alan was about to reach out and tap the man on the shoulder when the train suddenly lurched, causing him to stumble. When he regained his balance and looked back at the seat, the man was gone. The seat was empty, the leather suitcase gone as well. Alan blinked in confusion, his heart pounding in his chest. He was certain the man had been there just moments ago. But now, there was no trace of him, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Disturbed, Alan returned to his seat, his mind racing. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he just tired from his long trip? He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but deep down he knew something was terribly wrong. Chapter 2: The Haunted Station. The train rolled on through the night, and as it did, the weather outside grew increasingly severe. Rain began to lash against the windows, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. The fog thickened, obscuring the view of the landscape, and soon the train seemed to be hurtling through a void of endless gray. Alan glanced at his watch. It was nearly 2 a.m. He should have been nearing his destination, but there was no sign of the familiar eerily quiet. Then, with a hiss of hydraulics, the doors slid open. Curious, Alan stood up and peered out into the night. To his surprise, the train had stopped at a small, dilapidated station that he didn't recognize. The platform was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the station building itself looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling from the walls. Alan hesitated, unsure whether to disembark. There was no sign of life at the station, no station master, no passengers, nothing but the oppressive fog that seemed to cling to everything like a shroud. But something compelled him to step off the train, as if an unseen force was drawing him towards the station. As he set foot on the platform, he felt a chill that went beyond the cold night air. It was a deep, bone-chilling cold, the kind that seeps into your very soul. Alan looked around, his breath forming clouds in the air. The station was completely deserted, and the silence was so thick it was almost suffocating. He took a few cautious steps towards the station building, his footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The door to the building was ajar, creaking on its hinges as it swayed in the wind. Alan pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. The waiting room was filled with broken furniture, and the walls were covered in old, yellowed posters advertising train schedules from decades ago. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. Alan walked through the room, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. As he reached the ticket counter, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the counter, in the shadows, stood the man he had seen on the train, the man with the wide-brimmed hat and the leather suitcase. The man was staring at him, his pale face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. But there was something different about him now. His eyes, those sunken, hollow eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into a ghastly smile. Before Alan could react, the man vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Alan's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over the debris on the floor. He turned and fled from the station, his mind racing with fear. As he burst back onto the platform, he saw that the train was still there, its doors open, waiting for him. Without a second thought, he sprinted towards it and leaped inside, slamming the doors shut behind him. The train jolted into motion, and Alan collapsed into his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. He stared out the window as the station disappeared into the fog, the eerie silence returning once more. Chapter 3: The Conductor's Warning. The train resumed its journey, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks doing little to calm Alan's nerves. He tried to collect his thoughts to make sense of what had just happened, but his mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. Who was that man? And what was that station? As he sat there, lost in thought, the door to the carriage slid open, and the conductor entered. He was an older man, with a weathered face and a weary expression. He walked slowly down the aisle, checking tickets as he went. When he reached Alan, he paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at him. "Are you all right, sir?" the conductor asked, his voice tinged with concern. Alan hesitated, unsure whether to tell the conductor what he had seen. He didn't want to sound crazy, but he needed answers. I saw someone," Alan said, his voice trembling. "A man. He was on the train, and then he was at the station we just stopped at." The conductor's expression darkened, and he glanced around the carriage before leaning in closer. "You saw him, didn't you?" he said in a low voice. "The phantom passenger." Alan's heart skipped a beat. The phantom passenger. The conductor nodded slowly. "He's been haunting this train for years. No one knows who he was or why he's still here. But those who see him ... they never make it to their destination." A cold shiver ran down Alan's spine. "What do you mean?" The conductor sighed, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had settled upon them. "This train, it's cursed. Every so often it will stop at that old station, and the phantom passenger will appear. Those who see him are marked. They're drawn into his world, into the darkness. They disappear, and they're never seen again." Alan's mind raced as he tried to process what the conductor was saying. But ... what can I do? How do I get out of this? The conductor looked at him with a somber expression. "There's only one way, and it's not guaranteed. You have to confront him, face him directly, and demand your freedom. If you're strong enough, you might break the curse. But if you fail," he trailed off, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Alan swallowed hard, fear gripping him. He didn't want to confront the phantom passenger, didn't want to face whatever malevolent force was haunting the train. But what choice did he have? If he did nothing, he might disappear like all the others. The conductor placed a hand on Alan's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. I wish I could do more to help, but this is something you have to do on your own." With that, the conductor continued down the aisle, leaving Alan alone with his thoughts. Alan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. Could he really confront the phantom passenger? Did he even stand a chance? But deep down, he knew that he had no other option. If he wanted to survive, he had to face the horror head-on. Chapter 4. The Final Confrontation. The train continued its journey through the fog-shrouded night, the landscape outside the windows a blur of darkness and shadows. Alan sat in his seat, his heart pounding as he mentally prepared himself for what was to come. He knew the phantom passenger would appear again, it was only a matter of time. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching out like an eternity. The train seemed to slow down, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels growing fainter, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around him. Suddenly, the lights in the carriage flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. Alan's breath misted in the air as a cold chill seeped into the cabin. He looked around, his pulse quickening, and there, at the far end of the carriage, he saw him, the phantom passenger. The man was standing in the aisle now, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. His eyes glowed with that unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The air around him seemed to shimmer with a dark energy, and the shadows in the carriage grew longer, reaching out towards Alan like grasping hands. Alan's fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to stand, his legs trembling as he did so. He couldn't let the terror consume him, he had to be strong. The phantom passenger began to move towards him, his footsteps eerily silent on the floor. As he drew closer, the shadows deepened, and the cold became almost unbearable. Alan felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, suffocating him, but he stood his ground. "Who are you?" Alan demanded, his voice shaking but determined. "Why are you haunting this train?" The phantom passenger stopped just a few feet away from him, his head tilted to the side as if considering Alan's question. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the faint hum of the train's engines. Then, in a voice that sounded like the whisper of the wind through the trees, the phantom passenger spoke. "I am the lost soul of a man who died on this train many years ago, betrayed, murdered, left to wander the tracks for eternity. I seek vengeance, I seek justice, ... but none comes. So I take the souls of those who cross my path, trapping them in the darkness with me." Alan felt a pang of pity, but he knew he couldn't let it weaken him. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," he said, "but you don't have to keep doing this. You can find peace, you can move on." The phantom passenger's smile faded, replaced by a look of anger. "There is no peace for me. Only darkness, only pain. And now you will join me." With a sudden, terrifying speed, the phantom passenger lunged at Alan, his hands outstretched, fingers like claws. The shadows surged forward, enveloping Alan in a suffocating embrace. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, felt the darkness closing in on his mind, but he fought back with everything he had. "No," Alan shouted, pushing against the force that threatened to consume him. "I won't let you take me." With a surge of willpower, Alan reached out and grabbed the phantom passenger by the shoulders. The man's skin was icy cold, like touching a corpse, but Alan didn't let go. He stared into those glowing eyes, forcing himself to confront the fear, the horror. "I demand my freedom," Alan cried out, his voice ringing through the darkness. "I will not be trapped here." For a moment, the phantom passenger's expression faltered, and the shadows around them seemed to waver. The cold lessened, and Alan felt a glimmer of hope. But then the phantom passenger's face twisted into a snarl, and the darkness surged back with renewed fury. "You are mine," the phantom passenger hissed, his grip tightening on Alan. But Alan refused to give in. He summoned every ounce of strength he had, every bit of courage, and with a final desperate push, he wrenched himself free from the phantom passenger's grasp. The darkness shattered like glass, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The phantom passenger let out a scream of rage and despair, and then he too began to fade, his form disintegrating into wisps of smoke. As the last remnants of the phantom passenger vanished, the train jolted forward, and the lights in the carriage flickered back to life. The oppressive cold lifted, and the normal, rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks returned. Alan collapsed into his seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was over. The phantom passenger was gone. Conclusion: the return to reality. The train continued its journey through the night, but now the fog was clearing, and the landscape outside was beginning to take shape once more. Alan glanced at his watch and was shocked to see that it was nearly dawn. Had he really been on the train all night? It felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment. As the first light of morning broke over the horizon, the train began to slow, and soon they were pulling into the station of Alan's hometown. The familiar sights of the platform, the people bustling about, the sound of announcements over the PA system, it all felt surreal after the night he had just experienced. When the train came to a stop, Alan gathered his belongings and stepped off onto the platform. He felt a profound sense of relief as his feet touched solid ground. The nightmare was over, and he was safe. As he walked away from the train, he glanced back one last time. The train was still there, its windows reflecting the early morning light. But there, in one of the far carriages, he thought he saw a figure, a man in an old-fashioned suit, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, watching him. Alan blinked, and the figure was gone. Had it been his imagination, or had the phantom passenger really returned? He shook his head and turned away, deciding not to dwell on it. Whatever had happened on that train was over now, and he was ready to leave it behind. But as Alan walked away from the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that a part of him would always be haunted by the events of that night. The train had taken him on a journey through the darkness, through fear and terror, but he had survived. And now he would carry the memory of that night with him, a reminder that some things are better left unexplored, that some paths lead only to horror. As he stepped out into the bright morning sun, Alan took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The world was moving on, life was returning to normal, but he knew that he would never forget the midnight train, the phantom passenger, and the terrifying journey through the unknown.